A big part of my career has been looking at the therapeutic value of the 12 steps because the 12 steps really have harnessed some powerful psychological forces that creates an amazing change in our life. What is that change? Well, the truth is that the 12 steps are engineered to help us achieve emotional sobriety, to achieve true independence of spirit, to achieve autonomy, to learn how to take care of ourselves. These are things that we don't know. Emotional sobriety really helps us learn how to have a healthy relationship, how to have union with the preservation of our integrity, how to cooperate with integrity. Most of us get lost in our relationships. Most of us do a lot of things we don't want to do. We don't really know how to show up in a good way. Emotional sobriety is about learning to have healthy relationships.
Tonight, we are continuing our discussion of the 12 essential insights. And last week, I kicked off the discussion of no one is coming by exploring what I talked about is some of our toxic beliefs, which the belief that someone is going to come along and is going to, be the answer to all of my problems is an incredibly diminishing belief. It diminishes who I am. It diminishes possibilities in my life, and it really feeds in this emotional dependency. And so Herb is going to continue that discussion. Next week, Roger will then take the lead, and then I will come in again with another round of no one is coming. So Herb, is anybody coming tonight?
I hope my consciousness.
You're here. It's not true. Somebody came. You're here, Herb. Somebody did come.
I'm here. Yeah. As I finished that statement, as you've seen with my slides, but I love it. No one is coming. It's so like in your face. It's like cold water. It's kind of like, what do you mean no one's coming? And you told me, I think it was maybe Roger or you, that there was a psychologist, maybe it was Nathaniel Brandon actually had that sign in his office. But I took it into meditation because I took it seriously because it shocked me. And then I figured out, because of the work we've done, oh, I'm the one I'm waiting for. No one is coming. My belief, I didn't have the consciousness of that, but I had the behavior of it that I could see in retrospect. That was the way I behaved. I went into the monastery because I'm going to find God. Came out of the monastery. I went into psychology and therapy because I'm going to find help. I went into self-help, all kinds of life springs and all of the stuff that people do, at least in the 80s and the 70s, etc. And of course, alcohol and drugs is along that line. I'm not even going to go there. And then what was the next step?
Yeah, Life Spring, because I remember that.
Yeah.
Life
Right. And it was all about getting enough information and finding the right teachers and the right environment and it's I have a lot of notes, and they're not actually in any order, so I'm going to kind of like come at it spontaneously, which is okay. I'm comfortable with that. But it's pandemic in the world of addiction. I hear it all the time, and it certainly was my experience. I don't fit in. I don't know how people talk to one another. How do you behave in relationships? How do you even dress, and what do you say, and what's appropriate in terms of, I mean, even after I was married, I had to ask my wife certain things about what was appropriate social behavior, because I mean, I was actually awkward because I was raised in a hothouse of a monastery until I was 24. So I really didn't know. And then I began to thaw out as a result of the going into AA, and the story for a different day. And at about 5 years, I met a man who apparently did know, just the way he conducted himself and his words and the tone in his voice. And I knew he had something that I wanted. I know that only in retrospect. And I asked him to help me. as I'm thinking about it, our culture is really trained that way. Advertising has certainly taken advantage of it, but like Disney, I mean, the cavalry's coming, the white knight is coming, the fairy godmother, the princess, the fairy dust. I mean, and it's wonderful entertainment. Unfortunately, it seeps into us. If only I can have the car, the job, the person, the clothes. Carl Jung said it about in a letter to Bill Wilson. It's almost like human nature. I probably is. And he said, especially alcoholics, and I'll paraphrase it. He said, where alcoholics are unusually spiritual people. They have this deep hunger or thirst for the spirit, and they get distracted by spirits. Really works in a wordplay and alcohol spirits. And the word spirit comes from the Greek word spiros, meaning breath. And that's why it's so difficult to get our hands on the wind, on the breath, on this. You called it, I'm going to begin and end with a quote from you, Alan, from your chapter on this, No One Is Coming. You said, we possess an inner wisdom. We possess an inner wisdom. It's a profound source of information and comfort if you can really get into it and believe it. And the picture you use in your PowerPoints is the acorn that becomes the oak tree. And your question is, how does the acorn know how to become an oak tree? Well, it doesn't know it. I mean, there's no consciousness there, but it's driven. It's driven organically, given the right circumstances, to become this giant 100-foot, 100-year-old, gnarly oak tree. I mean, that's the way it just grows. And we can take that. That's the life force. That's the life force in us. But it can get distorted because we do have a mind that distorts reality based on lots of things, maybe genetics and maybe nurture. But also, we have free will. See, I was a seeker, always had this deep, deep thirst for I didn't know what. I didn't fit, I didn't feel, I didn't know, I didn't measure up to me and and I came into the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous with completely unconscious of all of this dynamic until I became conscious at 5 years of sobriety because of a process in which man gave me some information. He asked me a question. All right. He said about alcohol, and then in the third and fourth column of the resentment inventory, talking about your concepts and your beliefs and your story and your emotions, and looking at all of this visible stuff that you can attempt to measure, especially your behavior, and then getting underneath it. Bill in the big book says we get to the exact nature of it, the exact nature, not the calamity and the chaos that we create. That's the external stuff, the drama. But what's the exact nature? What's the underneath the resentment? What's your belief? Or using Fred Luskin's terms, your unenforceable rule, your story, your mythology about your life. And I didn't know it was a mythology. I didn't know it was a lie. I didn't know that I had made up stuff. Some of it hadn't even happened, and yet it was influencing my perception and my reaction to life. What were my beliefs? And then in the fourth column, taking a look at it, and these were questions that were asked of me. Well, what was the benefit to you, Herb, of holding from 8th grade? I'm 48 years old doing this work, a long time since I was in 8th grade. And he said, well, what was the motive for you holding this for 30 years? Well, he hurt me. Well, no, Herb, we know that. That's ancient history. What's your motive underneath? Motive comes from the Latin movere. What's moving you to hold this? What's the benefit to you and the value of this? And I got underneath it to see. And bottom line, without going through a tortuous unpacking here, is that it was my rationalization for being a victim. I had no idea. I mean, I've been the last person to acknowledge that I was a victim. I abhor victims. All right. No, I was. Let me tell you about my father. Let me tell you about my wife. Let me tell you about my four bosses, and I'd only had four bosses. Alan, you went through this in our therapy processes. Well, I hate the empty chair, but anyway, and I was between the combination of doing the inventory work and the therapy work, whatever we were doing, and whatever I was doing in other areas, I was able to connect to, oh my gosh, my motive was corrupt. My motive was based on a delusion. My motive was based on a lie, a story that I had incorporated into my life that I wasn't embarrassed a whole lot by my story and some of the revelations. I was, as I've said many times before, I was embarrassed by it. I had never seen it. I mean, I had looked sincerely. I'm reasonably intelligent, fairly well educated, and I had wonderful opportunities and environments, but none of it ever clicked. Coming to the place where I was able to see that I had choice. I had choice, not over my addiction and not over my unmanageability. You and Declan talked in the beginning about the root, and I was reminded of what Bill says in the big book about unmanageability and the spiritual malady on page 62. Selfishness, self-centeredness. Take it in the context. We're not talking about psychology, and we're not talking about, we're taking in the big book, in the context of the 1939 vocabulary and understanding, selfishness, self-centeredness, and what he means by that is I'm the center of the universe. I am, and I know the truth of that today, the center of my universe. It is true. I am the center. That gives me the agency and responsibility, all right? But I'm not the center of the universe. I mean, that's that 9 characteristics of narcissism that you so gleefully gave me in one of our sessions. He said, and you said, and I'll go public with it. Here, this is the 9 characteristics of what you're talking about, Herb. The only thing missing is your picture. And it was said in wonderful humor and good relationships. But I was like colorblind. I have a retinal deficiency that doesn't allow me to see gross colors, brown and green. I can't make it just because I don't have in my retina the ability to discern color. In my someplace in me is the inability to discern reality until I can. And I have a responsibility to take a look at my actions and my feelings and attitude to evaluate them. Where are they coming from in me? And I was taught that through this process of having a question, getting some information, taking some action, having an experience, which then generates more questions, and we go deeper and we go deeper, and we get from the surface, we get underneath it. And I'm going to wrap it. Oh, no, I'm not going to wrap it. It's kind of like the 4-minute time lapse clip of a monarch butterfly. If you haven't, if you haven't Googled it, it's a spiritual experience. It's as good as going to church for me. You watch a 4-minute time lapse on the seed of the caterpillar that becomes a caterpillar. The caterpillar then over time puts itself in a chrysalis, and literally disappears, dies in there. And then eventually there's this breaking open of the chrysalis, and you can just see little things kind of popping off. And if you try to help the butterfly emerge, you will kill the butterfly, because the butterfly has to struggle to break the chrysalis in order to have the strength of the wings to fly. But eventually, that seed that was a caterpillar that died in the chrysalis became a monarch butterfly. I mean, I get touched. That's the symbol of this transformation that certainly I experienced in the 12-step process, but that's available through this process of waking up in terms of emotional sobriety through the self-esteem, through the work of therapy, through the work of 12-step, through the work of good religion, through the work of good relationship, through the good work of some other form of transformation. There's lots of ways of doing it. The last thing you said was, well, that I'm going to quote that you said was, we have an innate access to wholeness. And one of my teachers uses the phrase about we have a core of goodness. I mean, you have to have some development and some spiritual strength to be able to see, hear, and actually accept that, because many of us feel so broken and so valueless and lack of worthiness. I saw that through the work that we did in self-esteem book. That it's very hard to embrace that term that we have a core of goodness or that we have an innate access to wholeness, but that's the hope. That's the hope of good therapy. That's the hope of good spirituality. That's certainly the hope of the 12-step process, that rehabilitation, that healing that takes place, that we become butterflies. Thanks.
Well, your analogy of the butterfly, the caterpillar becoming a butterfly, it really symbolizes that the way that you are, no one is coming, I'm the one I'm waiting for. And
Yeah.
that's the emergence of us being able to become what we can be.
Yeah.
It's so symbolic of that process and powerful, is the transformation that takes place in recovery. And we're seeing it with people now that are getting a sense of the power of emotional sobriety. It's really turning us into butterflies. I mean, it's
Yeah, and a monarch butterfly, to me, that's the queen or king of butterflies.
I mean, look, it is rocking us into that next dimension in our
Right.
recovery. No
Right.
question.
Yeah.
That was great. I think a great way to illustrate the power of that. You see, I was thinking about reflecting on this thing. Well, where does this fantasy come from that someone is coming? And I do think it's something that it's based on this idea that we've heard a lot of references to Dr. Harry Tiebout. You've made them, I've made them, other people, other scholars in recovery talk about just the importance of the observations he had, right? About the importance of surrender and the deflation of the ego and the difference between compliance and surrender in recovery, and all of those things were incredibly important. And one of the things that he, observed is that he saw that there was these childhood or childlike characteristics that persisted into adulthood. And that's what we're talking about, is this idea that because as an infant, someone has to come. We're not going to be able to figure this out.
You, especially today, I mean, I think the average age of independence is 25 or 30. They're still living in their mother's basement.
It's 40 probably, to tell you the truth. We call it failure to launch right now. There's a whole, but it's so true. I mean, it's also it's a very interesting dynamic, because I think that fantasy was real fueled in our childhood experiences. And part of what happens through frustration, and this is the important thing, the struggle to come out of the chrysalis you were talking about. Well, through frustration, Freud said, we start to develop a healthy ego. We start to be able to now delay our gratification and develop the inner resources to be able to soothe ourselves and to be able to deal with life on life's terms, if that frustration is given to us in a certain kind of a context.
Well, that's what you experienced and I experienced with Roar in the Rite of Passage.
Exactly, when we went through that whole process. Exactly. But so it's very interesting, the analogy that you have, because it so fits in terms of our development. And look, unfortunately, not many of us have that kind of experience where we develop that level of differentiation where we can let go of the idea that someone's going to come along and now to be able to support ourselves. I don't say rely on ourselves because that's different. Self-reliance is different than self-support.
Right.
Self-reliance is too individualistic. We're talking about self-support, which is recognizing the importance of our community, the importance of our relationships, the importance of our connections with each other, and to be able to honor them and to be able to make contact in such a way as to, get our needs met, but in a way that honors the other person too.
And the critical role of a teacher. I mean, so many, 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 many teachers I've had, each pivotal at each part of the journey. Not to break the chrysalis and let me out, but somehow to give me some information and or motivation and some hope to continue seeking until I was a finder.
There's so many wonderful things being written into chat. Elizabeth M says monarchs also possess the inner wisdom to fly exactly to where they need to go, even though they've never been there.
Yeah, yeah.
Think about that. Is
Oh,
we
no,
move,
no, it's perfect. Thank you.
we move to the light. That's a great, thank you, Elizabeth, for sharing that.
Yeah. Kind of.
So, Raj,
Yeah. So what happens to a monarch that's waiting to be saved, that's waiting to be born? It becomes a monarch. Okay. In other words, I didn't word it right. What happens to a monarch that is willing, as you guys said, to undergo that effort and that frustration? I'm projecting, obviously, what it's like for a monarch, right? And the answer is, without someone saving it,
Right.
it becomes a monarch. That's what I wanted to say.
Yeah.
And I like that analogy a lot, including your point, Alan, about frustration. But I would also add, and you did add it, you said in a certain context, because if we are given challenges developmentally that are way beyond our capability to cope with them, then that's destructive, that's traumatizing, right? That's damaging to us. So it's not just that we need frustration, but we need frustration that's appropriate to our level of development at that point, whether we're a few months old or 5 years old or so on. A couple of thoughts came to me while you were speaking, Herb, and I love how you brought in the teacher idea again, because it's such a source of confusion for so many people that I talk with and for myself at times. But it's not that we don't need teachers. It's not that we don't need mentors. It's not that we don't need other people, but it's about where I'm coming from in that need. So it's if I'm looking for people to save me, I'm going to remain lost. But if I get that I need to do a lot of the saving myself, then other people are not going to save me. But they can certainly, once I've done enough of my own internal work to develop myself, they can certainly enhance and in myriad ways contribute to my life, as hopefully I'm going to be able to contribute to theirs. But that's the distinction between waiting to be saved and understanding. I remember a Buddhist book I was reading a number of years ago, and this was by a longtime teacher of Buddhism. But she made the point that, for a while, at least in our lives, and hopefully for a long while, we're all searching. And for a while, we think that, having the right partner, as you guys have talked about, will do it. That will make me happy. That will be the answer for me. Or getting the right car, or having the right home, or living in the right neighborhood, or having a children in a certain kind of home behind a picket fence. And she said, what happens is we have to wear those out. And I liked the way that she put it. Most of us, we keep trying those answers, but it's only when we've been disappointed enough,
Oh, yeah.
frustrated
Yeah.
enough, to use your term, Alan, that then, and she also put, which I thought was beautiful, we think the right spiritual program will do it. We learn, right? And then we become more evolved, if you want to look at it that way. And now we're going to be more spiritual, and that's going to save us. And she pointed out, no, a conceptual orientation of spirituality and how spirituality is going to save us is no better than any of the other things, the car, the partner, the job, the money. It's the internal experience. It's the internal work. And you mentioned that, Alan, in your chapter. I want to read a little bit of that. You talk about a client named Philip that you had throughout this chapter. This was Philip's toxic idea, that there was something out there, because it's not just necessarily another person. It can be, like I said, it can be a life situation we want to create or that kind of thing. The toxic idea was that there was something out there that would rescue Philip from his pain. Philip hitched his life to the idea that someone was coming to the rescue. This idea is toxic because it diminished the role Philip needed to play in his own healing. Only Philip could unearth the events buried inside him that caused his pain and suffering. He alone needed to find the words that would surface his pain, allow him to share it with another person, and begin to heal his wounds. No one else could give these words to him. He needed to rescue himself. So again, we're not saying that other people don't play an incredibly important role, but we're the ones, usually after a lot of frustration and a lot of paths that didn't turn out to be the answer, we're the only ones who can do that internal search. We can be assisted in that too, but again, it's a difference. I'm not looking for you to save me. I'm looking for you to assist me on my journey. Right? I'm not looking for you to rescue me. I'm looking for you to assist me or help me and support me. One other point I wanted to make, Al, you maybe include it usually, but it really caught my ear tonight when you said, we developed this belief that we can't be okay unless reality is the way we think it should be and the way we believe it ought to be. And it lines up with their ideas of what's right and what's wrong, and we're on the right side of it. But then you also said, we have this idea that reality has to be the way we want it to be for us to be okay. And that really, really caught my ear, because we often talk about, it's our false self that has all these ideas about how life should be and how we should be and so on and so forth. But that's not the whole story. We can also be too tightly wedded to the idea that the wants of my authentic self have to be satisfied by the world around me and by people around me in order for me to be okay. And my experience is oftentimes they're not. So then what's my relationship to what I really want? Not being found by me. And the answer is sadness and frustration and pain, right? But it doesn't mean that in a fundamental way, I can't still have a sense of peace and contentment with myself and with my life, even if my want in the moment, however authentic it might be, isn't met. And I'm not saying I'm not going to be disappointed or angry or frustrated. Of course I will be. But that really caught me. It's not just the disappointments to our false self that we're concerned with. It can also be disappointments to our authentic self. There was one other thing that really caught my ear that you had said, Herb, but it eludes me right now. So I think I'll leave it at that.
The Al-Anons have a science of distinguishing between helping and enabling. But your last comments reminded me of something from the 60s that I heard, one of the hippie kinds of phrases. is be with the one you love, and if you can't, love the one you're with.
Yeah, I remember that song well. Believe me, love the one you're with. It had all kinds of implications for me as
Yes,
a young
it
man.
does.
I remember, but I do remember that. You know, I did think about the other thing was, from my perspective, and for a couple of decades, the only kind of work I did with clients was body-oriented, emotion-oriented work, where I was trying to help clients work through unresolved feelings of pain and fear and anger and so on, from earlier in their life. And you know, it's commonly understood that to the extent our needs were not adequately met, nobody's needs are perfectly met. Some people's needs are overmet, and then the monarch can't leave the chrysalis for that reason, right? In fact, a therapist I like a lot, named Milton Erickson, says he's not sure which clients are the most difficult and challenging for him to work with: the clients who were very deprived in terms of their needs being met, or the clients who were not given any experience of frustration in their life at all. We're just overindulged. That's the right word. But to the extent a lot of our needs and our deepest needs, for, you talked about it in mentioning Karen Horney Allen, love, acceptance, and belonging, are not met. And that's certainly the case for many of us in our childhoods, as it was for our parents before us, and so on. We will, as Alan has said, we will demand that the present and the future repair and heal the pain of our past. And my perspective is, it's only when we've run that dry, right, and we found out that that doesn't work, that we begin to experience and become aware of those unmet needs. And if you're like me, you've got really deep defenses built in from a very young age against feeling those feelings of wanting and desiring closeness and desiring connection. So it's through the process of awareness and beginning to face that unmet need, face the pain of it, face the fears connected with it. That's what allows acceptance to develop, from my perspective. And it's that acceptance, from my point of view, and that's what we'll go to in the next chapter: acceptance of life, but also acceptance of self. It's that acceptance of our pain and no longer running from it and hiding from it and being at war with it. That's what can allow us to find our center of gravity in ourselves, as you talk about it, Alan.
And 100%. And acceptance does not mean resignation. Because there's the agency. I accept and I adjust, but I'm going to do the best I can to have the quality and or whatever else it is that is within the scope of common sense and reality.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, wonderful discussion, man. I just love how we get to flesh this out and to have this interaction and this synergy that happens in this discussion. It was wonderful, Raj. You sweetened the pot. Hope I did as well. And Herb, you set the pot on the stove for us. So thank you.
Good, wonderful, thank you. So if there's, I guess Tom takes it from here.
I will take it from here. You know, there's a theme which I've come back to, and you know, Alan talked about the difference between self-support and self-reliance, and I'm a fan of let's say disaster stories, right, or survival stories and the like, and I think that you know, we need some Sherpas, you know, we need some guides in our lives, right? Someone who to set the ropes, like, here's the path, but I've got to put the gear on, and I've got to climb, you know, I got to make the effort myself. Hopefully I've got the right guides that aren't leading me off the cliff. But you know, at least when I get to the edge, I you know, I can make a decision on my own if I'm going to just continue following that, or if I think there's something wrong here, and readjust. And the other theme I love is like this, it's the good news, bad news, right? It's when I hear no one is coming, that seems like bad news. But then it's like, no, the good news is no one is coming. That means that, the growth and opening that's happened through recovery and emotional sobriety means that I now have some responsibility, agency. It's like, oh, I could take the rope and start climbing myself, because if I'm waiting around, I might freeze to death on the side of the mountain for someone to drag my ass up there. So there's always good news in that, that initial reaction.
Does someone need to believe in God to successfully overcome addiction? Well, the way I like to think about what the program does, it connects us to who we really are. And what does that mean? Well, there's this incredible force in you and I, this growth force. It's the force that moved us from crawling to walking. You wanted to take those first steps. And when you fell, and you fell a lot of times, you didn't let your failures stop you. You picked yourself up, you learned from it. And how many times did you fail before you walked? You failed as many times as you needed to. You see that force, I call it a biological imperative, a psychological imperative, a spiritual imperative. It's moving you towards wholeness. It's moving you to be what you can be. Just like in the acorn is all the information it needs to become an oak tree. In you is all the information you need to become you. Become a you that can cope with life and to deal with whatever you need to deal with to be okay. And that's what I'll talk about in my new book, The 12 Essential Insights for Emotional Sobriety.